Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 3rd, 2017, the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Evans, is recognized for 60 minutes as a designee for the Minority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remark, including extraneous material on the subject of the special order.
Without objection.
It is with great honor that I rise today to anchor the CBC Special Order Hour. I'd like to thank the CBC Chairman, Cedric Richmond, for his leadership in this effort. Chairman Richmond has been leading this effort and raising the question about when the President said, what do we have to lose? The Chairman indicated that we have a lot to lose. So for the next 60 minutes, we have an opportunity to speak directly to the American people about issues of great importance to the Congressional Black Caucus and the millions of constituents we represent. Tonight's special order is about gun violence. I thank my colleagues for joining me here today to speak about the national epidemic of gun violence, an important topic to us all. The black community is at a critical point because we have a lot to lose, because too many of our neighborhoods, unfortunately, have been subject to gun violence at a consistent rate, crime which often goes unpunished because of unreliable witnesses. On February the 14th, this nation once again witnessed a horrific tragedy that took place in a high school in Florida. 17 lives were taken at the hands of guns in terms of firepower. The honor and tragedy of this shocking Florida high school should be unimaginable event in this country. Yet, tragically, our nation has lost too many loved ones at the hands of gun violence to a point where we often see the same reaction. Hand-wringing, blaming going around, but nothing's done to stop the violence. The city of Philadelphia knows all too well the lives we have lost at the hands of gun violence. In 2017, we saw the city experience its largest homicide epidemic since 2012. There were over 317 homicides in Philadelphia, according to the data from the Philadelphia Police Department. And with the continuous scourge of gun violence in Philadelphia, last year I hand-delivered a letter to the Pennsylvania Attorney General, Josh Shapiro, outlining our Commonwealth's need to use all resources possible to advocate for common sense gun reform. Since I landed that letter to our Commonwealth Attorney, we have been more heartbreaks in America, including the unspeakable tragedy at church, place of worship, and Texas, and a mass shooting in Las Vegas. Mr. Speaker, there's a gentleman who is our leader from our caucus who will speak to this issue. He knows an awful lot about it, and I've watched him in the short period of time I've been here. The Honorable James Clyburn from the 6th District.
Thank you very much, Representative Evans, for granting me some time. Mr. Speaker, I proudly represent the 6th Congressional District of South Carolina in this august body. And this past week, I spent a significant amount of time throughout the district meeting with faith leaders as well as other community-based organizations. And one of the things I kept hearing, it came from people who are particularly interested in whether or not this Congress will do anything to respond to this horrific problem that we have with guns. Of all the things that I find myself talking about, the one thing that bothers me most is the fact that we seem to be no longer safe in our most sacred institutions. I often quote Alexis de Tocqueville, who came to this country way back in the early 1800s, seeking what he called the magic of this great country. He said that he went throughout the country looking at our institutions, educational institutions, legislative bodies, trying to find the magic of this great country. Alexis de Tocqueville says that he could not find it in any of these places. He said that it was not until he went into our churches and synagogues that he found the real magic of this great country. He said that he came to the conclusion that in spite of all of the difficulties and challenges we had as a country, that America was great because Americans are good. And he went on to surmise that if Americans ever cease to be good, America will cease to be great. It's kind of interesting that he came to that conclusion by visiting our places of worship. And tonight I want to remind the American people that that sacred institution has been violated time and time again. And on this question of gun violence, we remember the Emmanuel nine soulful Bible study pupils in the basement of their church, once again reestablishing the goodness of Americans. They had that goodness violated by a young man with a gun who sat among them for a full hour before opening fire, killing 9 of them. Now, when we think about that incident, and we ask ourselves, how could such a thing happen? One of the things that we do know is that this young man was able to purchase a weapon, although under the law, he was not eligible to make the purchase. But because of a little loophole that we have in the law, a loophole that I have taken to call the Charleston loophole. The loophole says simply that if the background check is not completed within 3 days, that the purchase can proceed to conclusion. Now, the fact of the matter is, this gun was purchased in West Columbia. I don't know whether or not this young man had enough sophistication about the law to give the wrong information about his address. But what we do know is that the wrong address was keyed in. And because it was keyed in, there was difficulty trying to get the information that was needed. And by the time they found out the problem, the 3 days had expired, and the young man went back to get the gun, and within days traveled all the way from Columbia, South Carolina, down to Charleston. He picked this church because he said it was historic. He wanted to go into a historic black church. Well, this month, the nation has set aside time to honor the contributions of black Americans. I can think of no way for us to better highlight what this month is all about than to once and for all close this Charleston loophole, to demonstrate to those 9 African-American worshipers who are going about the business of helping to make this country great, going about the business of demonstrating the goodness of Americans, to have their lives snuffed out, I can think of no better way for us to honor their lives than for us to close this loophole. And on tomorrow, I'm going to come before this body with a discharge petition, because the legislation to close this loophole was filed in this body last July. It's been hanging around now for 8 months. And I'm going to ask all of my colleagues, Democrats and Republicans, to sign this discharge petition before the end of this Black History Month, so that we can say to those souls, rest in peace. With that, I'll yield back.
Mr. Speaker, may I ask the gentleman a question before he, once you, if you could just take a second more about that magic you talked about, and how do we get there? Do you have any sense of?
Well, thank you very much. Well, I believe, I'm kind of a sort of a history buff.
Right.
And so I spent a little time trying to find out what this country is all about. And I also recall a great writer, George Santayana, once writing that if we fail to learn the lessons of our history, we're bound to repeat them. I believe that history should be instructive. And I think that that's what de Tocqueville was talking about in his writings. He really came to this country from France to study our penal system on that particular occasion. But he was enamored with this country because of its people. Now, the interesting thing about this, remember the early 1800s when he came here, slavery was a law of the land. And he wrote about how contradictory that was to what he found in people's hearts, the goodness that he found in people. And so irrespective of what the challenges may be of the various institutions that we might have, the various legal issues that may come before us, the various legislative accomplishments we might make, irrespective of all that, there is a certain goodness in Americans that ought to be on demonstration at all times. And I really feel that it will demonstrate that goodness if we can say to these 9 souls that just as Alexis de Tocqueville found in our places of worship what the basic goodness about America is all about, that is what you were in pursuit of as you sat in the basement of your church, Emmanuel AME on Calhoun Street, Charleston, South Carolina. You were there perpetuating that goodness, and it was violated. And I believe that this body can take a long step toward demonstrating how important that is by saying in their memory, we are going to close this loophole so that their 9 souls can rest in peace.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, you just heard the gentleman from South Carolina, in my view, lay out a very clear vision of what it should be like from an aspiration standpoint. And speaking of the leader of the Congressional Black Caucus, leading the conscience of this body, is a gentleman from the great state of Louisiana. He knows a little bit about that. My understanding, he has legislation that he has in. That's Chairman Cedric Richmond from the 2nd District of Louisiana.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the gentleman from Pennsylvania for once again leading the Congressional Black Caucus's Special Order Hour, where we get to address the American people and talk directly to the American people about what it is that's going on in Congress, what we'd like to do. And tonight is a very somber but important Special Order Hour. We're talking about protecting American lives. And it would not be Black History Month without a quote from Dr. Martin Luther King, a Morehouse graduate. But he says at some point, silence becomes betrayal. And I want us to just think about that. Silence becomes betrayal. This Congress, when it comes to our communities being inundated with guns, this Congress has been far too silent. In fact, what we do is just take moments of silence, one after another, whether it is Virginia Tech, moment of silence, Sandy Hook, moment of silence, Mother Emanuel, moment of silence, Pulse nightclub, moment of silence, First Baptist Church, moment of silence, Las Vegas, moment of silence, Mother Emanuel, moment of silence. So far in 2018, we've already seen 8,200 incidents of gun violence in America, including 34 mass shootings. These acts of violence have taken more than 2,200 lives. That's 2,200 families affected by gun violence. And I would just say that it's time for Congress to do something, at least have the debate. But we ought not become co-conspirators with the crimes that are being committed across this country. And I know that many people will say that, hey, you all are in Congress, you all deal in theory, we deal in reality. The banning assault weapons wouldn't have kept this kid from being able to buy an AR-15. Well, let me just tell you, that's not true. An AR-15 from the store ranges about $500 to $600. And a kid could probably get $500 to $600. But during the days of the assault weapons ban, those guns, the street value became 3 times as much. So that means that $600 gun that he bought would have been $1,800. And the question is whether he would have had access to get to that $1,800, whether good common sense would have prevailed before he got to $1,800, whether somebody would have caught on to his plan while he tried to get $1,800. At some point, we can't not do anything because we say it wouldn't have made a difference. The one thing I will say is it's amazing to see these young people rise up and speak out with one voice that they want something done. It's a sad day in America when our seniors can't go to church without fear of gun violence, when families can't go to the movies because of fear of gun violence, and when children can't go to school because of fear of gun violence. We, as a Congress, both Democrats and Republicans, have an obligation to this country to make sure that we protect people that are vulnerable. And I don't think it's too much to ask for both sides to come together and ignore the will of the National Rifle Association, but to listen to the people in our country who are demanding that we do something. And when we start talking about background checks, assault rifles, high-capacity cartridges that go in these guns, which allow people to shoot large amounts of people in a very short order of time, those guns, and let's just be clear, and Congressman Evans, I want you to understand what we're talking about. Nobody's talking about ending the Second Amendment. The right to bear arms is as fundamental and as protected as anything else in this country. However, when you start talking about AR-15s and these assault weapons and these automatic things, you're talking about weapons of mass destruction. You know, we went to Afghanistan looking for weapons of mass destruction. Well, they're right here in this country. We don't have to go to Iraq. We don't have to go to Afghanistan. If you're looking for weapons of mass destruction, they're sold in our sporting goods shops all across this country, and they're being used to slaughter American citizens. So I just ask in closing that at some point, silence is betrayal. And as for me, because of my conviction, because of my conscience, and because I don't lack any courage, I will not be silent. And I would just urge this body that we can't be silent anymore as weapons of mass destruction destroy our communities. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I'll yield back.
Mr. Speaker, before the gentleman, I want to, being that this is the 50th anniversary of Dr. King's assassination, to the point that you raised about the moments of silence, if you look back and look where we are today, are we any closer to addressing these moments of silence? Because I hear frustration in your voice.
I am frustrated. You know, I come from a funeral home family, and I know what it's like when people have to bury loved ones. And I know the natural order of things because I've had to bury my father and my stepfather and my grandparents, who were, my grandfather specifically, who stepped in for my father when he died. But that's the natural order of things. Although my dad died when he was 33, it was of natural causes. Parents shouldn't be burying children. Children shouldn't be victims and shot in school. So the frustration comes because I know the pain associated. So when we start talking about the 2,200 people that were killed, that's 2,200 families that had to get up and hear the preacher say, oh, pain may endure through the night, but joy cometh in the morning. Well, joy is not going to come in the morning if the same thing keeps happening and Congress will not do anything about it. Because that means those lives were lost in vain. And that is just as big a sin in my estimation. I just think that we have to do something about it. You know, it's one thing when the cameras are there and the family has the support at the funeral of all these people. The congressperson comes, family comes, and they, oh, we're going to be with you and we're going to support you and pray for you during this time. But at the end of the day, that mother and father goes back to that house, and that kid's room is empty. There's no words of comfort that we can give to that family when they walk by that room every night and it's empty because we let somebody with mental issues get their hands on an AR-15 and slaughter a bunch of kids in school. So if it sounds like I'm upset, then you're right. Because those parents shouldn't have to pass an empty room. And every empty room that happens, my fear is that we're complicit by omission of letting it happen over and over again. And I don't want that on my conscience. So thank you for asking me the question, and with that, I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the chairman for laying out that eloquent statement. Someone who's from the great state of Illinois, who, since I've been here, she's been relentless on this issue, particularly from an inner city standpoint, an urban standpoint, and I've watched her over and over again constantly stand up and make comments. And I wonder if she thinks anybody's listening, but I'm going to give her that opportunity to say a few things here this evening. So I yield to the Honorable Robin Kelly from the 2nd District of Illinois.
I thank you, my distinguished colleague, Mr. Evans, for yielding. Thank you for your leadership, and I associate myself with the words of my colleagues who have already spoken. Mr. Speaker, I never tire in my call to end senseless gun violence, but I'm emboldened this evening by the grassroots movement we have seen from the brave and bright students that survived the shooting at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, which took the lives of 17 of their classmates and teachers. These brave students remind me of the determined young people I've come to know in the Chicago area who have been calling for change. To my Republican colleagues, do you remember the terror you felt this past summer on the baseball diamond when you were senselessly attacked with a rifle? Do you remember the terror you felt as grown men? Now imagine being a teenager without the protection of trained Capitol Police officers at your side, being senselessly attacked with an AR-15. Imagine being raised in a world where fear of being shot at school, on your block, or in a park was a daily reality. Countless daily shootings that do not make the news certainly don't spur you to act. Losing 20 elementary school students didn't spur you to act. A colleague suffering a severe brain injury didn't spur you to act. You yourselves being the targets hasn't even spurred you to act. In the aftermath of Parkland, our children have made one thing abundantly clear. If you do not act to end this senseless violence, America will replace you with bold leaders who will. The solutions are simple. Mandatory background checks on all gun sales, including purchases online and at gun shows, and tightening the background check system, closing the loopholes, removing weapons of war from our streets, implementing gun violence protective orders, allowing scientists to study this issue for what it is, a public health crisis, and investing in programs that provide young people with hope so they put down guns and pick up pens, pencils, books, and job skills. When appropriate, access to mental health. You cut the budget to mental health, yet you blame mental health as the reason these things are happening. None of these proposals are new. In my first term in Congress, I issued the Kelly Report, and studying this issue with each of these recommendations, I will gladly provide every member of this House a copy. The solutions and the choice are clear. Will you stand up to the NRA? Will you even read my report? Our children are demanding it. I yield back.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to ask just one question to the gentlelady from Illinois. And you've been speaking to this issue a lot. You have any sense of optimism of people hearing you in any way? You see any signs? I mean, you just ticked off some information. What's your thoughts about change around here?
Representative, I couldn't be in this job if I wasn't an optimist, believe me. And I think people hear me is whether they're willing to act. There are bipartisan bills ready to go. Bipartisan bills. Some bills are sponsored by Republicans, some by Democrats. They have a lot of co-sponsors. But the leadership has to hear. The leadership has to want to do something. And actually, the leadership on both sides has been very, very silent, unfortunately. But I'm hoping that the pressure will continue to be put on by everybody across this United States.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have someone who I have utmost respect for him, and he smiles. I told him he could get elected in Pennsylvania. He's from the great state of Mississippi. I don't want to shock to the people of Mississippi. He's not leaving Mississippi. He's my good colleague, 2nd Congressional District, Mr. Benny Thompson. Yield.
Thank you very much. My good friend from Pennsylvania. I won't be coming and running, but nonetheless, I appreciate the kind words. I'm going to talk in a little different direction than from most of the previous speakers. As you know, Mr. Speaker, and Mr. Evans, you know, I'm a country boy. I live in the country. Hunting is a rite of passage for most people who live in the country. For the record, this past Friday, I rabbit hunted with 3 ministers, 2 deputy sheriffs, county commissioner, and just a bunch of everyday people. But I don't need an assault weapon to rabbit hunt with. So this notion that somehow an infringement on my Second Amendment right to bear arms is associated with a killing weapon, a weapon that was designed for war, a weapon that's designed to reap carnage in whatever environment that it's in. So, you know, for those of us who hunt deer, who hunt ducks, who hunt pheasants, we look at this whole discussion and say, who are these people who want 30, 40, 50 shot clips in a gun? What are they hunting? And so those of us who are outdoorsmen, those of us who love the environment, we are not supportive of this notion that these kind of guns are made for outdoors. They are not. So it's a false premise, Mr. Chair, that somehow my rights are being abridged. Now, as important with this is this notion that somehow we are not safe unless I own a gun like this. Well, the people that I hunt with, they have absolutely no problem applying for whatever license they are required to have to own their gun. They don't have a problem with waiting so that they can clear up whatever question it is from the standpoint of owning a gun. They really don't have a problem with saying gun shows should be outlawed because those are places where people sell guns, and sometimes there's a question about the legality of the guns they're selling. Background checks. You know, if I have to have background check for financing of anything, then why shouldn't I have a background check to own a weapon? A bump stock. Now, until what had occurred in Las Vegas, most of us had never heard of a bump stock. I mean, it was just some kind of exotic thing you put on a gun to make it an automatic weapon. But again, all those things to those of us who hunt, that's not who we are. And I marvel at some of my colleagues who probably couldn't hit anything with a gun, but they want to stand up and defend people who buy assault weapons. I challenge them to come, get up 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning, and let's go to the woods, and let's do what real hunters do. Let's not just get on TV and brag about my Second Amendment right, and then you put your $500 suit on and go on downtown and don't go to the woods. So this notion that what we saw in Florida, it was absolutely tragic. Errors occurred, we need to fix it. But I dare to say, and I absolutely hope I'm wrong, when the comments subside, I doubt that we will have any legislation brought forward to address this assault weapon problem we have in this country. I doubt if we'll have any legislation brought forward to look at the loopholes associated with purchasing guns. I doubt if we'll have the age limit raised on individuals purchasing guns. The will is not here. I wish my colleagues could man up or woman up and do the right thing. I'm training my grandson, who's 12 years old, the right way to own a gun, to handle a gun, to do the things that are correct. He will have to go through gun safety classes before he gets his license. But more importantly is he understands that this weapon is either for sport or protection. But you know, I don't need an AR-15. I have deer rifles. I have shotguns. That's what sportsmen use. So all this killing that's going on is bad, and I really wish we take the emotions out and say, let's just get rid of these high-powered weapons that are killing machines. So I could go on and on. My colleague from Pennsylvania, but I won't. But I can just say that it's a problem, and I don't think the will is here in this body to address it. Every time a tragedy occurs, we take a moment of silence and we do nothing. I yield back.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask the gentleman, since I've never seen what this thing called APR, can you describe what this looks like? This gun, what, you know?
This AR-15?
Yeah, what if, yes.
Well, it's a weapon designed to kill. It's a weapon designed for war. My friends who are in law enforcement, I want them to have weapons like that to defend themselves here. But if we have made these guns street legal so that the potential that our friends in law enforcement are going to run up on people who have guns as powerful, if not more powerful, than they are. So that gun is not made for hunting. It's not made for anything other than to kill. I want my soldiers who are fighting wars to have weapons like that. But again, for us to try to stretch the margin, that's a Second Amendment right to bear arms, it's not any arm. And so, again, it's a killing machine. And if anybody's ever had an opportunity to fire one, which I have, it's not accurate at all, but it will spray a lot of bullets out and will do some killing, like we just saw in Florida and a lot of other places. So it's not who we are as a nation. We are better people than that. But adults are going to have to do the right thing. Otherwise, the young people of this country will do it for us.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think the gentleman, he thought gave a really clear sense of what the challenge is and the use of what we face today. Can I ask the Speaker how much time do we?
2 minutes.
22 minutes, okay. The interesting, coming behind the gentleman from Mississippi, we have someone who knows a little bit about weaponry. She herself, a background, she was a the chief in Orlando. And since she and I are in the same class, I've learned a lot from her. And coming behind the gentleman from Mississippi who laid some things out, here's someone who's run a police department, and couldn't be a better person for us to have her come. The general lady from the state of Florida, Val Demings, the 10th District. I yield.
I want to thank my colleague from Pennsylvania. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to talk about an all too familiar topic, and that is gun violence in America, mass shootings in the United States of America. A few days ago, I purchased a card of sympathy for the family of a young man who died way too soon. The card that I finally chose read, "I hardly know what to say." When I think about yet another mass shooting in a country where, through ingenuity and determination, we have solved some of the world's toughest problems and challenges, but yet we have chosen to do nothing about mass shootings, I hardly know what to say. Mr. Speaker, you know, last week a man used a semi-automatic rifle to brutally murder 17 children and educators in Parkland, Florida. Unlike past shootings, we have not just moved on. This is because of the survivors, not our generation doing something, but the children. It's because of them. You see, this generation believes that they can change the world. I mean, isn't that exactly what we as parents taught them, that they can change the world? They believe in what President Obama called the audacity of hope, not our generation, but the generation of our children and grandchildren. And they have stood up to declare what should be obvious to all of us, that every American should have the right to go to school, to go to church, to go to a mall, to go to a movie theater or a nightclub without being brutally murdered by someone with a gun. No less an assault rifle, which greatly diminishes their chances of survival. Sure, high school is tough for some children, but the worst all children should have to fear is whether they can make a friend in a new school, or whether they will make the track team, or whether the boy or girl they like will notice them in the hallway or in class. 150,000 American children have experienced a school shooting. That is not something a great society tolerates. That is something we change. Mr. Speaker, I'm proud of the strength, the courage, the passion of these young people in Florida, not our generation, but the teenagers. And I am also proud of previous survivors and activists who laid the groundwork for the movement that is growing across America. Survivors at the Pulse nightclub shooting have joined Parkland survivors to work for change. That shooting, which took place in my congressional district, was the second worst mass shooting in U.S. history after Las Vegas. That is not the only mass shooting to torment Florida. In 2017, a man shot and killed 5 people at the Fort Lauderdale airport. In 2013, a man shot and killed 6 people at an apartment complex in Miami-Dade County. In 1990, a man shot and killed 9 people in Jacksonville. According to the Gun Violence Archives, there have been at least 113 mass shootings defined as 4 or more persons injured or killed in Florida since 2013. Instead of simply waiting and responding to mass shootings, we should work to prevent them. We should work to prevent them. We should work to prevent them. As Orlando, Florida's former chief of police, my goal was to not merely save lives of those who experience violence, but we tried to stop the violence from occurring in the first place. When we know better, we're supposed to do better. Some proposals may need more debate, some less. But let us have that debate. As a former law enforcement officer, our job was to enforce the laws and to protect the innocent. As a member of Congress, our job is to create laws that protect the innocent. Well, Congress is failing at that job. The best gift, Mr. Speaker, we can give to our teachers and our students and to every American is to pass legislation that keeps deadly guns out of the hands of bad people. Thoughts and prayers are good. God will order our steps, but we have to move our feet. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask my colleague from Florida just a question since she talked about her law enforcement background. And You're correct. Congress is to make laws, and the presidential administration talks about being law and order. Is he really law and order and on the side of the police if this is happening and running amok? I mean, if you was police chief and you have that responsibility of protecting people, and we in Congress, as was stated by the chairman of the Congressional Black Caucus, the moments of silence, what would you, if you was on the front line again, you was out there and you still know a lot of the people who are part of police departments, I mean, how do you think the police departments feel when they're outgunned and the challenges that they have? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, Mr. Evans, one of my biggest fears as a 27-year law enforcement officer was that my officers, the officers who worked for me, the officers who swore that they would protect and serve, would find themselves in an active shooter situation where they would be outgunned. And as I indicated earlier, the AR-15 and other weapons like it, if you are shot with one, your chances of survival are greatly diminished. As my colleague indicated earlier from Mississippi, the weapon is designed to create mass devastation. It was designed for the battlefield, and you're right, on the battlefield we want our soldiers to take the enemy down as quickly as possible. But those weapons were not designed for our streets, for our neighborhoods where our children play, for our schools. If we're a great society, if we want to be the great nation that we always talk about, then let's do what is within our power as one of the most powerful bodies in the world. My 5-year-old granddaughter's kindergarten class had a moment of silence. I believe as members of Congress, we can do better than that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Congressman from Florida. I have someone who, when I came here, said, I have to meet her. She's a very dynamic person, and she's the Honorable Barbara Lee from the 13th Congressional District of California, and I yield the comments to her.
Thank you very much, Congressman Evans, and I want to thank you for your tremendous leadership and your friendship, and thank you for hosting this very important special hour. Your leadership in our caucus to fight the epidemic of gun violence in America is bold, it's visionary, and thank you for calling us together tonight, Congressman Evans. And also let me just acknowledge my sister and colleague, Congresswoman Robin Kelly, who spoke earlier. Congresswoman Kelly chairs our Congressional Black Caucus Health Brain Trust, and she continues to demand that gun violence be treated as a public health crisis that it is. So I rise today with my colleagues in the Congressional Black Caucus to say enough is enough. The epidemic of gun violence in America must be brought to an end. 2 weeks ago, the world stood in shock as yet another gunman massacred innocent students and teachers in an American school. The 19-year-old killer legally purchased an AR-15 assault rifle and killed 17 students at Stoneman Douglas High School. My heart goes out to the victims, their classmates, families, and the entire Parkland community. We must take action so that this never happens again. Newtown, Aurora, Charleston, Orlando, Las Vegas, and now Parkland. This is not normal in a civilized society. The United States of America is the only developed nation that experiences mass shootings with this level of frequency. This doesn't happen anywhere else in the world. Because, of course, we know it's because the National Rifle Association can't buy their votes in other countries, and that children's lives come first. Speaker Ryan and the Republicans in Congress have been bought by the National Rifle Association and making it easier for mass shootings to occur. And let me just say that mass shootings in public schools, unfortunately, are just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to gun violence in America. Our communities, especially in our urban communities, they're war zones. On an average, 93 innocent lives in America are cut short due to gun violence. This year alone, there have been over 8,200 incidents of gun violence in America, including 24 mass shootings. These senseless acts of violence have taken more than 2,200 lives already. I represent the 13th Congressional District of California in the Bay Area, which includes the city of Oakland, which has been brutalized by gun violence. Since 2014, 312 of my constituents have had their lives cut short by gun violence. Our community feels their loss every single day. Here are just a few of their names and tragic stories. Devon Ellis. Devon was a star football player and an excellent student at Oakland Tech High School. He was shot and killed while walking home from school. My nephew was walking with him when he was gunned down. Trayvon Godfrey. Trayvon was killed in 2016 while sitting in a car with his friends in front of his home. Every time I think about Trayvon, my heart breaks. Trayvon came to a town meeting that I held on gun violence in January of 2016. And Trayvon shared, and he was worried about coming to that town meeting, and he shared the toll that gun violence had taken on his life and that of his friends' lives. But yet he was determined to make a difference and finish school and go on to college. Less than a year later, on November 28th in 2016, Trayvon and his lifelong friend, Dante Miller, were shot and killed in broad daylight. Here's Annabelle Andreas. Annabelle was Oakland's youngest gun victim in 2017. He was only 13 years old and was shot outside of a community center. Francisca Martinez Ramirez. She was one of Oakland's first homicide victims in 2018 and killed by her husband during a domestic dispute. Sadly, these heartbreaking stories are all too familiar in communities across the country. More than 30,000 Americans lose their lives to gun violence each year. Shootings now kill as many Americans as car accidents. Last year, there were 77 gun violence homicides in my home city of Oakland, and already this year there have been 12. This is only February, Mr. Speaker. How much bloodshed will we see this year? We need action, and we need it now. We need to pass, of course, the bipartisan King-Thompson legislation that strengthens background checks and keeps guns out of the wrong hands. And yes, we need to reinstitute a ban on assault weapons to get these weapons of war out of our communities. And we need to close the gun show loophole once and for all. Passing our Assistant Leader, Congressman Clyburn's legislation to close the 3-day loophole to require background checks to be completed before you can buy a gun, that legislation is long overdue. That's common sense. At some point, we have to stand up and say enough is enough and stand up to this NRA. 97% of Americans support some form of gun violence prevention legislation. So that's why I'm standing here tonight with my colleagues from the CBC, demanding that the Speaker take action and bring common sense gun legislation to the floor for a vote. Give us a vote, Speaker Ryan. Give us a vote. Thank you, and I yield the balance of my time.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I really do. I think showing those pictures, if anything, should get a point across. I hope, my colleague, that those pictures will send a message to all of us, and I thank you very much. Closing out tonight, and I think all our colleagues really just summed up this gun violence issue, but someone who, again, I've known well and admired, the Honorable Sheila Jackson Lee from the 18th District in Texas. So I yield.
Let me thank the distinguished gentleman from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, for his leadership. I'm delighted to join the Congressional Black Caucus this evening under the leadership of Chairman Richmond. And as my colleagues have said, we have been sadly a leader on common sense gun safety legislation, sadly because many of our districts, although we represent the huge numbers of diverse Americans, our districts represent Anglos and African Americans, Hispanics and Asians, all economic backgrounds, all wealth backgrounds, all backgrounds dealing with religion. We are able to speak because many of our districts have the reality of gun violence. So I want to speak, Congressman, to a particular point that I have heard from the stander-uppers of the NRA, and particularly the president and CEO when he spoke to the conservative organization just this past week. I was certainly shocked to hear accusations about Democrats as socialists, even to the extent of calling out members' names, which I think patently rejects the comedy and collegiality of recognizing democracy accepts two distinct parties and some other parties and respects differences of opinion. But let me be very clear on the record. No one member of this body, you, distinguished gentleman, can eliminate the Second Amendment. No group of 20 members of Congress, no all Republicans of Congress, no Democrats of Congress can eliminate the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment is a constitutional amendment, and there is a decided practice of a percentage of members of Congress and the percentage of members of 50 states. And with that in mind, let us clear the air. But if we want to know the truth, what is being fought is gun safety legislation, not gun eradication. In my state, you cannot rent a car if you're not 21. The federal law says that you cannot buy a gun if you're not 21. I'll be introducing legislation to raise the age of 21. I already have legislation on a 7-day waiting period, banning bump stocks, and of course, dealing with automatic weapons. I know that we are introducing one now. There are a multitude of introductions of bills, multitude of decisions being made by the Florida delegation, which we should listen to, and I hope they will come forward in a bipartisan way. But let me talk about the children and parents. I was on the air today talking or hearing that parents are hovering and scared of sending their children to school, and the children are scared. This last week, I went into my schools where children were not only talking about not arming teachers, but the gunfire in their neighborhoods by handguns, or those who were in schools dealing with children who had steered in the wrong direction. Those children were talking about you gotta pack. Gun culture doesn't realize what we are turning our children into, that they've got to pack. So from Las Vegas to Orlando to Virginia to San Diego to San Bernardino to now Douglas High School, the question is, when are we going to act? An average of 1,297 children die annually from gun-related injuries. A majority of Americans now support gun policy proposals such as barring people with mental illness from buying guns. But let me make it very clear. I don't label people that suffer from mental health issues. What I say is, let us provide the resources for those individuals, and clearly between mistakes of reporting what this young man had indicated, to mistakes on the local and federal level, to mistakes on his mental health situation, we all can stand in blame. But they're adults. And what the response has been from our good friends who are the gun advocates, so they say, has been to close their eyes, close their ears, and not sit down at the table of reconciliation. The gun manufacturers cannot continue to dominate the discussion of sensible gun legislation. From Gabby Giffords to the tragedies that I've listed, to my children who are saying, I hover in my room, my bedroom, listening to gunfire in my neighborhood because the proliferation of guns is so extensive. So guns are being trafficked illegally because of the gun culture. And there are many elements that will go into this. The Congressional Black Caucus has been at the forefront of changing that gun culture, as Congresswoman Kelly has preached about, because of what happens in Chicago. I join her because what happens in our neighborhoods is that our children are cowering over gun violence, period. No, arming our teachers is not the answer. Securing our school is. Banning those weapons of war are. Extending the time frame is. Lifting the age is. And getting the checks, the gun checks, background checks to close the loopholes is. And so I'm asking this floor, I'm asking this leadership, as we're doing good legislation on human trafficking, of which I will participate in tomorrow, I am asking that we put on the floor legislation of gun safety. And I thank the gentleman for yielding and thank him for his leadership tonight.
Thank you. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 3rd, 2017, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Mitchell, is